We just don't think we can sit there and pretend, my mother said. And she said it the way you'd decline a second helping of something you'd already decided was beneath you. Gently, almost kindly, as if she were doing me a favor by being honest. I was standing at my own kitchen counter with a wedding 3 weeks away and a phone going warm against my ear, and I understood, in the space of one sentence, that my parents were not going to come. She didn't say it was because of Daniel. She didn't have to. She said the word pretend, and the word did all the work. Pretend to be happy. Pretend he was enough. Pretend the man I'd chosen wasn't, in her words from an earlier conversation, a little simple. He worked with his hands. He didn't have letters after his name. And to my mother, that made him a thing you might hire, but never a thing you'd stand up in front of God and family to celebrate. I was 41 years old. I had spent every one of those years learning not to need them. I thought I'd gotten good at it. My name is Diane, and this is the day the asking changed direction. Hi, I'm Martin. Sit with me for a bit. Tonight we're going to spend some time with Diane, 41, a high school chemistry teacher, a woman who married a quiet man her family decided wasn't worth showing up for. Her parents skipped her wedding to protect their pride. By the end of that same day, their pride was the only thing they had left to spend. New here, subscribe. We do this every day. Let's go. The invitation to my parents went out with all the others, on the same cream cardstock, in the same square envelope, addressed in the same hand. I want you to understand that I didn't single them out. I didn't write them a special letter pleading my case. I treated them exactly the way I treated my aunt in Ohio and Daniel's cousins from upstate: a name, an address, a date, a request for the favor of a reply. That was deliberate. By 41, I had learned that the surest way to lose with my mother was to want something visibly. So I made my wanting invisible. I put their invitation in the blue mailbox on the corner of Hartley and Vine, with my heart doing something complicated in my chest. And I let go of the little brass handle and walked home and told myself it was just an envelope. Their reply came back faster than anyone else's. That should have told me everything. People who are deciding take time. People who have already decided answer by return mail. It wasn't even the reply card. It was the save the date I'd sent months earlier, the little magnet one with our names on it, returned in a plain envelope with a post-it stuck to the front. My mother's handwriting, which I would know on the far side of the moon. "We'll let you know about the weekend," it said. 3 years of community college nights to finish my degree. 22 years of teaching other people's children the difference between an acid and a base. A whole adult life built brick by careful brick. And my mother sent back the magnet. The magnet that was supposed to go on the refrigerator. The one you keep. I stood in the entryway and turned it over in my hands. And Daniel came in from the garage with sawdust on his forearms and that particular stillness he carries. And he looked at the magnet, and he looked at my face, and he didn't say anything clever. He just said, "You want tea, or you want to be left alone?" And I said tea, and he made it. And that was the first night I understood the difference between a man who manages your feelings and a man who simply stands near them. Let me tell you about Daniel, because my mother never bothered to, and somebody should. Daniel Hart was 44 when I married him. He builds things out of wood, not the flat-pack things you screw together with a little wrench, but the real things, the kind that outlive the people who order them. Staircases, library walls, a dining table for a family that wanted it to seat their grandchildren's grandchildren. He owns a shop on the east side of town with heartwood painted on the brick in letters he painted himself. And he owns the building under the shop, and he owns the lot beside it, and he doesn't owe a dollar to a single soul on this earth. He drives a 1998 Ford with 211,000 miles on it, because in his words, it runs and I know it sounds. He has never once told me how much money he has. I learned the shape of it slowly, the way you learn the depth of a lake by waiting. And what I learned was that the man my family called simple had quietly built something most of them only pretended to have. On the day the magnet came back, all I knew was that he made good tea and didn't crowd my grief. I met Daniel because my classroom flooded. A pipe let go over a long weekend my third year at the high school, and it came down through the ceiling and ruined a decade of the things teachers accumulate: the lab models, the periodic table I'd laminated by hand, the drawings my students made that I wasn't supposed to keep, but did. The district sent a restoration crew, and Daniel ran it back then, before the cabinetry took over. And he showed up on a Saturday to assess the damage, while I was there salvaging what I could. I was crying a little over a papier-mâché atom a former student had made, which is an embarrassing thing to be caught crying over by a stranger. He didn't pretend not to see it, and he didn't make it a big thing. He looked at the atom, which had lost an electron to the water, and he said, "I can dry that out slow in my shop if you want. Newspaper and time. Might warp some, but it'll keep." And he took my ruined paper atom home, and he dried it out slow with newspaper and time. And 3 weeks later, he brought it back, warped some, but kept. And that was the whole beginning. A man who looked at a broken thing that everyone else would have thrown away and said, "I can dry that out slow." I should have known then everything I'd know later. He'd been telling me who he was from the first afternoon. I just didn't have the ears for it yet. It took my family's whole catastrophe to teach me how to hear what Daniel had been saying quietly all along. To understand my mother, you have to understand my father. And to understand my father, you have to go back further than either of them would ever let you go in conversation. My father, Raymond Coleman, grew up poor. Not the soft, retrospective poor that people romanticize at dinner parties. We didn't have much, but we had love. The kind where the lights go out because the bill didn't get paid, and your mother tells you it's an adventure, and you're old enough to know it isn't. He grew up in a rented half of a house on the wrong end of a mill town, the son of a woman who cleaned other people's homes, and a man who left before my father formed a single memory of his face. And my father clawed his way out of that with a ferocity I have never seen him bring to anything else. He took a job as a teller at 19. He wore the same 2 shirts and washed them on alternate nights. He became an assistant manager, then a manager, then the manager of the largest branch in the regional network. The man who decided who in our town got a mortgage and who got a handshake and a no. He bought a house with a brick front and a circular drive. He joined the club. He learned which fork. He spent 50 years putting an entire ocean between himself and that rented half a house. And the thing about an ocean is that you spend the rest of your life afraid of the water. That's what Daniel was to my father. Not a man, a tide, a reminder of the shore he'd swum away from. Daniel worked with his hands, the way my grandfather, my father's father, the one who left, was rumored to have worked with his hands before he became a rumor. When my father looked at the sawdust on Daniel's forearms, he didn't see craftsmanship. He saw the undertow. I know all this now. I've had years to assemble it, the way you assemble a thing from 1,000 small pieces and only see the picture at the end. At the time, all I knew was that my father had a way of going quiet and tight around Daniel, and that the quiet was the most dangerous thing about him. My mother, Patricia, came from people who'd had money and lost it, which is its own kind of poverty, the kind that leaves you forever performing a wealth you no longer possess. She sold real estate for 30 years, which is to say, she sold the idea of arrival to people who hadn't arrived. She had an instinct for status, the way some people have perfect pitch. She could walk into a room and price every person in it within 10 seconds. And she was almost never wrong, and she never once let on that she was doing it. To my mother, my marriage to Daniel wasn't a tragedy. It was a misprice, a property listed wrong, and she could not stop herself from correcting the listing. There was a moment, about a year before the wedding, that I think about more than I'd like to. We'd had them over for dinner, Daniel and me, in the house Daniel had remodeled himself, every cabinet and every sill the work of his own hands. My mother walked through it the way she'd walk through 1,000 open houses, running a fingertip along the kitchen counter, opening a drawer to feel it slide. And I watched her face do the math, and I watched her decide not to say the number out loud, because saying it would have meant admitting it was a good number. Instead, she turned to Daniel, who had built all of it, and she said, "It's very charming, very handmade." And she made the word handmade sound like a diagnosis. Daniel just said, "Thank you." He meant it too. That was the part my mother could never get her hands around. He genuinely took it as a compliment, because to him, handmade was the highest thing a thing could be. She'd reached for a knife, and he'd accepted a gift. You cannot wound a man who doesn't share your idea of what a wound is. And my father, that same night, did the thing he does. He waited until Daniel went out to the garage to get the wine he'd been aging, and then he leaned across the table to me, lowered his voice to the register he used for serious financial counsel, and said, "A man who works with his hands is a fine thing to hire, Diane. It's a different thing to marry." He said it the way he'd once explained interest rates to me, patiently, as a kindness, as though he were saving me from a bad investment. I said nothing. I had learned in that family that saying nothing was the only move that didn't cost me something. But I remember looking at my father's hands as he said it. Soft hands, banker's hands, hands that had signed away other people's homes, and thinking that I'd take Daniel's sawdust over those clean fingers any day of my life. I didn't say that either. I just refilled his water glass and changed the subject to my brother, which was always the surest way to make my parents happy. There were other corrections, smaller ones, the kind that don't survive being repeated because each one alone sounds like nothing. At a restaurant once, for my father's birthday, Daniel ordered his steak the way he likes it, and my mother said to the waiter, not to Daniel, "He'll have it medium. He just doesn't know it yet," and laughed, and the table laughed, and Daniel ate it the way she ordered it, rather than make a thing of it. And I sat there and hated, for one clean second, every person at that table, including myself, for laughing along. Another time, Daniel offered, genuinely, warmly, the only way he knows how to offer, to rebuild the back steps of my parents' house, which had gone soft and dangerous with rot. He wasn't angling for anything. He'd simply noticed a broken thing. My father thanked him with the particular coldness he reserved for charity he didn't want to accept from beneath him, and then hired a contractor who charged him $4,000 and built steps that were visibly crooked. My father kept those crooked steps for years, rather than let my husband fix them for free. I used to look at them every time I visited, the slight wrongness of them, the way the third one canted toward the railing, and I understood that I was looking at a price my father had decided to pay, in money and in safety, for the privilege of not being in debt to the man who sanded wood. My brother. I have to tell you about Kevin, because Kevin is the hinge the whole door swings on, though I didn't know it yet. Kevin is 3 years younger than me, and was, from the day he was born, the answer to a question my parents had apparently been asking before I arrived. Where I was the daughter who could be left alone, Kevin was the son who lit up the room. Where I dop a speech about being understanding, Kevin got the thing I was being understanding about. I don't say this with the heat I once felt. I say it the way you'd read a measurement. By the time I was 9, I understood the architecture of our family. I was the load-bearing wall, the one you don't decorate because its job is to hold up the house. And Kevin was the bay window everyone stood at to admire the view. Kevin grew up to do something with money. I've never been entirely able to explain what. Wealth management, he called it, which, as far as I could tell, meant he wore very good suits and spoke with great confidence about other people's money in rooms with leather chairs. He had a condo with a view of the river, and a car that cost more than I made in a year, and a way of saying the word liquidity that made my father's eyes shine. My parents bankrolled the early part of it, the suits, the deposit on the condo, the membership that opened the right doors, an investment in his future, my mother called it. When I'd needed help finishing my degree, the same family had explained to me gently that I was already an adult and these were the kinds of things adults handled themselves. Both things were true at once. That's the part that takes the longest to make peace with. Not the cruelty, but the arithmetic of it, the way the love was real and simply never pointed at me when pointing cost them anything. And Kevin, who had every reason to be generous, was the cruelest of all of them about Daniel. Not in the soft, deniable way my mother managed it. Kevin was direct. The first time he met Daniel, at a family lunch, he shook his hand, looked at the calluses, and said, "So, you're the guy who sands wood." He smiled when he said it. He thought it was funny. Daniel said, among other things, and Kevin had already turned away, because in Kevin's world, a man who sanded wood wasn't a man you finished a sentence with. There's one more thing about Kevin I have to tell you, and it's the thing I buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it didn't matter. 8 years before my wedding, when Kevin was just getting started, my parents came to me. This was rare enough that I should have known something was wrong. They sat in my old apartment, the small one I had before Daniel, and my mother did the talking, and my father studied his shoes, and what they wanted was a loan. Kevin had an opportunity, they said, a timing thing, a sure thing that needed cash this week, not next, and theirs was tied up, and it would only be for a few months, and family helps family. I had $11,000 saved. It was 4 years of saying no to things. It was the down payment I was building toward, the small future I was assembling in a coffee can, the way my mother once made adventure out of darkness. I gave them 9,000 of it. I kept 2, so I wouldn't feel completely naked. I never saw it again. There was no dramatic refusal, no fight. The few months became a year, and the year became a thing nobody mentioned. And when I once carefully brought it up, my mother looked genuinely confused and said, "Oh, Diane, that was years ago. Surely you're not keeping ledgers on family." And the thing is, she believed it. That's what I need you to understand about my mother. She wasn't lying. In the version of the family she lived inside, money flowed from me to them as naturally as water flows downhill. And asking about it was a kind of bad manners, a vulgarity, the sort of thing simple people did. I stopped keeping ledgers, out loud anyway. But some part of me kept the number, 9,000. I'd find it in my head on long drives, the way your tongue finds a missing tooth. So that was the family Daniel married into, 3 weeks after my mother returned the refrigerator magnet. I want to be honest with you about something, because the easy version of this story is one where I'm a saint who is simply wronged, and the true version is more interesting and less flattering. In the days after that phone call, in the small hours when I couldn't sleep, I did not always think pure thoughts. I laid next to Daniel, who slept the deep sleep of a man with nothing on his conscience, and I rehearsed. I rehearsed what I'd say if they ever needed me. I'd built whole conversations in the dark, not shouting matches. I was never a shouter, but quiet little scenes in which my mother came to me in some future trouble, and I got to deliver a sentence so calm and so final that it would land like a door closing. I'd refine the sentence. I'd polish it. I'm not proud of those nights. There was a hunger in them that didn't match the person I tried to be in daylight. I wanted very badly to one day be the one who could afford to say no. I wanted to watch them learn what I'd had to learn at 9, which is that need is a humiliation, and that being the one who doesn't need is the only safety there is. I'm telling you this so you'll know I'm not a saint. When I tell you what happened at the end of that day and what I felt watching it, you should know the soil it grew in. 3 days before the wedding, I did something I've never told Daniel about. I drove to my parents' house. I didn't plan it exactly. I'd been out running an errand for the caterer, and I found myself turning onto their street, the way your car sometimes drives itself, to the places your heart still keeps an address for. I parked across from the house with the brick front and the circular drive. I know now what was happening inside those walls in those days, the certified letters, the silence at the kitchen table, but I didn't know it then. And I sat there with the engine off, and I composed in my head the speech that would make them come. I was good at speeches by then. I'd been writing the other kind, the cruel kind, in the dark for weeks. But this one was different. This one was small and naked, and it went, more or less, please. Please just come. You don't have to like him. You don't have to say a single word. Just sit in the chair so I don't have to look at it empty. Just let me have, for one day, the thing other people get without asking. I sat there for 20 minutes. The porch light came on. It was getting toward dusk, and I saw a shape move behind the curtain in the front room, my mother probably. And I put my hand on the door handle to get out and go ring the bell and say the naked thing. And then I took my hand off the handle, and I started the car, and I drove home. Because I knew, with the certainty you only have about the people who made you, that if I went up those crooked steps and asked, if I let them see how much I wanted it, the wanting would become the thing they kept. It would be repeated at holidays. Diane practically begged us, you know. It would become a story about my need rather than their absence. I had learned that lesson at 9 years old, and I was not going to unlearn it 3 days before my wedding. So I drove home and told Renata I'd been stuck in traffic, and I never said the naked thing, and the chair stayed empty. I've wondered ever since whether that was strength or just the old wound choosing for me one more time. I still don't know. I've stopped needing to. The wedding was at a place called the Caldwell Barn, which is exactly what it sounds like, a working barn that a family had restored and now rented out, with long tables and string lights and big sliding doors that opened onto a field that in late September goes the color of a lion. It wasn't grand. My mother, had she come, would have priced it in seconds and found it wanting. To me, it was the most beautiful place on earth, partly because Daniel had spent 2 weekends there before the wedding, quietly fixing things the owners hadn't gotten to. A sagging gate, a railing that wobbled, a barn door that screamed on its trek until he planed it and oiled it, and it slid like a whisper. That was Daniel's wedding gift to the place that would marry us. He fixed it. Nobody asked him to. He just couldn't stand near a broken thing and leave it broken. I want to spend a moment on the morning because I've noticed that when people tell these stories, they race to the part where everything turns, and they skip the ordinary hours. And the ordinary hours are where you actually live. I woke at the little inn down the road at 6:40 before my alarm, the way you wake on the mornings that matter. The light was gray and going gold. I lay there and listened to a bird I couldn't maim, working through the same 4 notes over and over. And I thought about my dress hanging on the back of the door. And I thought, with a calm that surprised me, that my parents weren't coming, and that the world was, against all my childhood evidence, going to keep turning anyway. My friend Renata, who teaches biology 2 doors down from my classroom, and who had appointed herself my matron of honor without much consultation, knocked at 7:30 with 2 coffees and a face full of careful cheer. She'd heard about my parents. She didn't bring it up. She just handed me the coffee and said, "Okay, today nobody who isn't here gets a vote." And I have thought about that sentence many times since. Nobody who isn't here gets a vote. We did the small things. The hair which never sits the way the magazines promise. The dress, which my grandmother had to help with the back of because Renata's hands were shaking more than mine. Yes, my grandmother. I haven't told you yet. Let me tell you now, because she's the reason the mourning held. My grandmother, Vivian Coleman, was 89 years old at my wedding, and she is the only member of my father's family who came. She is my father's mother. She is the woman from the rented half a house. She is the one who told a frightened little boy that the dark was an adventure. The one who cleaned other people's homes so that her son could one day own one with a brick front. And she watched that son swim so far from the shore that he became ashamed of the water she'd taught him to survive. My grandmother knew poor the way you know your own hands. And so my grandmother, alone among them, was incapable of being fooled by a man's calluses. She had told me, weeks earlier, on the phone, in her flat, dry voice that has never once in my life wasted a word. Your mother thinks she's too good to sit in a barn. I have sat in worse than a barn and married worse than Daniel. I'll be there. Save me a chair where I can see his face when he sees you. And she was. My uncle drove her the 3 hours. She arrived in a navy dress she'd had since the Carter administration and a brooch shaped like a sparrow. And when she saw the barn, with its string lights and its lion-colored field, she didn't price it. She said, "Well, isn't this something?" And she meant it as the highest thing a place could be. There were 2 empty chairs in the front row. I want to be honest about those chairs. We'd set them up before we knew for certain, back when there was still a version of the day with my parents in it. And by the time we knew, it felt worse to take them away than to leave them. So they sat there, 2 empty chairs in the front row, reserved with little cards in calligraphy that said Mother of the Bride and Father of the Bride. And everybody saw them, and nobody said a word, and they were the loudest thing in the building. My grandmother sat in the chair beside them, on purpose. She told my uncle to put her right next to the empty ones, and when I asked her why, later, she said, so they wouldn't look so alone. I didn't understand for a long time whether she meant the chairs or whether she meant me. I should tell you about the other side of the barn, because a wedding has 2 sides, and I've spent this whole story on mine. Daniel's people filled the room my family had emptied. His brother Pete came up from 2 states south with a wife and 4 kids and a cooler of something homemade that the venue definitely had a policy against. His mother Joan, 73, who'd raised 2 boys alone after Daniel's father died under a truck he was fixing. Daniel comes by it honest, the inability to leave a broken thing, sat in the second row in a dress the color of a robin's egg, and cried through the whole ceremony and apologized to strangers for it. There were men from Daniel's shop and the men who supplied his lumber, and a retired school teacher he'd built a wheelchair ramp for one weekend and never charged, and the owners of the barn whose gate and railing and screaming door he'd quietly healed. These were not impressive people by my mother's measure. Not one of them could have told you the difference between a hedge fund and a hedge, but they had come 3 states and 2 states and across town, and they had brought coolers and casseroles and a robin's egg dress, and they filled my wedding so completely that a stranger walking in would never have guessed 2 of the most important chairs in it were sitting empty. Pete found me before the ceremony, in the little room where I was waiting, and he didn't make a speech either. It runs in the family. He just said, "I don't know what's wrong with your people, but you got us now, and we show up. Ask anybody. We're not fancy, but we show up." I have thought about that many times in the years since. We're not fancy, but we show up. There are worse things to carve into a family. I won't pretend the ceremony itself was the hard part. The hard part is always before and after. The ceremony is the eye of it, the still center where for 20 minutes the world is exactly the size of 2 people and you forget who didn't come. Daniel cried, quietly in the way of a man who has spent his whole life being told men don't, and then doing it anyway because something in him is too honest to perform. When the officiant, a friend of Daniel's named Sal, who'd gotten ordained on the internet for the occasion, asked who blessed this union, my grandmother stood up, all 4'11" of her, gripping the chair in front of her, and said, "I do. I'm enough of them." And the barn laughed, the warm, wet laugh of people who understood exactly what she was saying. And I looked at the 2 empty chairs beside her, and then I looked at her standing there, 89 years old, doing the job of an entire family. And I have never in my life loved anyone the way I loved my grandmother in that second. The reception was the kind of evening I'd stopped letting myself imagine I'd get. We ate barbecue off mismatched plates because Daniel and I had both, separately, hated the idea of a meal where you couldn't tell what anything was. Pete's kids ran the length of the barn in their good clothes until the good clothes stopped being good. Sal, who'd married us off an internet certificate an hour earlier, gave a toast that started as a joke about Daniel's truck and ended, without quite meaning to, somewhere that made the whole barn go quiet. He said he'd known Daniel 20 years and never once heard him say a cruel thing about a single living person, and that he'd wondered for 20 years how a man managed that, and that watching Daniel look at me, he thought maybe he'd finally understood. Renata cried. Joan cried again. My grandmother didn't cry. She sat very straight and watched everything with the attention of a woman cataloging a happiness she meant to take with her. And I'll be honest about what ran underneath the evening for me, because I promised you honesty. Underneath the music and the barbecue and the running children, there was a thin, cold wire of grief. The empty chair grief, the knowledge that on the most documented day of my life, there would be no photograph with my mother and father in it, that 30 years from now I'd open an album and find a hole where they should have been. You can be the happiest you've ever been and still feel that wire. Both things sit in the chest at once. Nobody warns you that joy doesn't cancel grief. They just move in together and learn to share the same small room. That should have been the worst of it. A daughter's wedding, 2 empty chairs, an old woman standing in for the missing. If the story ended there, it would still be a story, a small sad one about a family that chose its pride over its child, the kind of thing that happens quietly in towns like mine every single weekend and never makes a sound. But the day wasn't over. It wasn't, in fact, close to over. Here is what I didn't know, sitting at the long table under the string lights as the field went from lion to ash to the deep blue of early evening. I didn't know that 90 miles away, in the house with the brick front and the circular drive, my parents' entire life was on fire, and had been for 2 years, and that the smoke had finally reached the rooms they couldn't keep me out of. I have had to reconstruct this part. Some of it my mother told me later, in pieces, in the careful way she tells anything that doesn't flatter her. Some of it Kevin told me, much later, when he had nothing left to protect. And some of it I worked out myself, from a single document I eventually held in my hands. So understand that I'm telling it to you the way I assembled it, not the way I lived it, because while I was dancing in a barn with sawdust still faintly in the air, I knew none of it. 2 years before my wedding, Kevin had brought my father an opportunity. That word again, opportunity, the same word that had cost me $9,000 8 years earlier. This one was bigger. It was a development, a lakeside project an hour north, condominiums and a marina, the kind of thing that exists mostly as a glossy rendering and a confident young man in a good suit. The confident young man, in this case, was partly my brother, who had assembled investors, and partly a developer named Carl Denton, whom I never met, and who I'm told was very persuasive right up until the week he stopped returning calls. My father didn't just invest his savings. I could have understood that. A man gambling money he could afford to lose, chasing the high of being a player at 70. What my father did was worse and more human. He signed a personal guarantee. He used the respectability he'd spent 50 years building, the brick front, the spotless credit, the name that meant something at his old bank, as collateral on his son's dream, because he could not bear to be the father who said no to Kevin, and because somewhere in him, the boy from the rented half a house still needed, at 71, to prove he belonged among the people who did this sort of thing. He didn't tell my mother the extent of it. He told her they'd invested with Kevin. He did not tell her about the guarantee. He did not tell her that the Lakeside Dream had a fuse on it, and that the fuse was a balloon payment, and that the balloon payment came due. I have to pause even now at the cruelty of the timing, except it wasn't cruelty. It was just the indifferent machinery of a calendar, the Monday morning after my wedding. Carl Denton was gone. The project was a hole in the ground full of rainwater and a half-built marina office that would never have a desk in it. The bank, my father's own bank, the institution he had given his life to, now run by men a third his age, who knew him only as a name on an old plaque at Sempa Letters. First the polite ones, then the certified ones, then the final one, the one with a date on it, the one that explained in the flat language of finance that on Monday morning they would begin the process of taking the house with the brick front and the circular drive, the proof of everything, the far shore my father had swum a lifetime to reach. And the number that stood between my parents and that morning, the number that paid by close of business would buy them 60 more days to refinance, to scramble, to find some dignity-preserving way out, was $74,000. Kevin didn't have it. Kevin, it turned out, was more leverage than any of them. His whole glittering life a structure of borrowing held up by the next deal, and the next deal had just collapsed into a rainwater hole an hour north. My mother, when she finally learned the truth of it that Saturday afternoon in the kitchen with the good light, did the only math she had never learned to do, which was the math of a family that had run out of people to ask. My mother described that afternoon to me later, and it's the only time in my life she's told me about her own fear without dressing it first. She'd spent the morning of my wedding, she said, not at a spa and not on the road to some weekend they'd invented as a cover, but at the kitchen table, while my father finally laid the certified letters in front of her and stopped protecting her from the size of it. The worst part, she said, wasn't the number. The worst part was the dates on the letters, the months of them. The discovery that the man she'd been married to for 46 years had carried this alone since before the previous Christmas, smiling at her across that table, refusing the one thing she might have been able to give him, which was to be frightened alongside him. She said she looked at the postmarks and understood that her husband had decided his pride was worth more than her partnership, and that she'd taught him that. Both of them had taught each other that, across half a century, and that they were now going to lose the house that pride had built because neither of them had ever once learned to simply say, "I'm afraid and I need help." Except one. There was exactly one person in the family with $74,000 in reach who hadn't been ruined by Carl Denton. One person who owned his building and the lot beside it and owed nothing to anyone. One person they had, that very morning, been too proud to sit in a barn for. The man who sanded wood. The first sign I had that the day was about to turn came at about 7 in the evening, in the form of my brother walking into a barn he had not been invited to. I saw him before he saw me. He was standing just inside the big sliding door, the one Daniel had planed so it ran like a whisper. And he was wrong in a way I clocked instantly, the way you clock that something's off about a person you've known your whole life. Kevin is a man built for entrances. He arrives. But this Kevin had come in sideways, scanning the room, and his suit, for the first time in my memory, looked like a costume on him instead of a skin. He found my face across the barn, and something flickered over his, and it took me a second to name it, because I'd never once seen it on Kevin before. It was fear. I went to him because what else do you do? Renata started to come with me, and I touched her arm, and she stayed. Kevin pulled me into the little side room where the barn kept its folding tables, away from the music. And he didn't say congratulations, and he didn't say you look beautiful, and he didn't apologize for our parents. He said, "Diane, I need to talk to you about Mom and Dad, and I need you to not make a thing of it. I want to tell you that I was gracious. I was not entirely. There was a half second, standing in that room full of folding tables in my wedding dress, where the thing I'd rehearsed in the dark rose up in me like a tide of my own, and I almost said something I'd been polishing for weeks. Instead, I looked at my brother, who had called my husband the guy who sands wood, who had spent $9,000 of my dollars 8 years ago and never once felt the weight of it. And I heard myself say, very quietly, "Make a thing of what, Kevin?" And he told me, not all of it. He gave me the version that protected him, the version where he was a bystander to a tragedy rather than its author. But enough. Mom and Dad were in trouble. Real trouble. The house. There was a number and a deadline, and they'd exhausted everything. And he actually said this. My brother actually stood in a barn at my wedding and said this. And we were hoping Daniel might be in a position to help, given his situation. His situation. 8 hours after my mother couldn't sit in a barn for Daniel, my brother was standing in that barn asking for Daniel's money, and he called it Daniel's situation, as if the man's worth were a delicate condition you mentioned in a lowered voice. I didn't answer Kevin. I told him to wait there, and I walked back out into the music and the string lights, and I found my husband. Daniel was at the dessert table, of all places, helping the caterer's teenage son figure out why the coffee urn had stopped working. Of course he was. There was a broken thing in the room, and Daniel had found it. He had his suit jacket off and his sleeves rolled, and he was looking into the back of an industrial coffee urn at his own wedding with the total absorption of a man for whom no problem is beneath attention. I stood there for a second just watching him, and the watching steadied me. Then I touched his shoulder and told him my brother was here and why. I watched Daniel take it in. He didn't get angry. I have seen Daniel angry exactly twice in our life together, and neither time was about himself. He just set down the little screwdriver he'd been using on the urn and wiped his hands on the cloth the caterer's son handed him. And he said, "Are your parents here too?" And that's when my mother walked in. She came through the whisper-quiet door into the warm noise of my wedding, and she stopped, the way you stop when you walk into a room and realize all at once how it's going to look in the morning when people tell the story. My father was a step behind her. I had not seen them in 5 weeks. I want to describe them honestly because the temptation is to make them small and ruined and easy to hate, and that's not what I saw. What I saw was my parents looking, for the first time in my life, like the people they'd spent 50 years outrunning. My father had on his good gray suit, the funeral and bank meeting suit, and his face above it was the gray of the suit, and his hands, I noticed his hands, the soft banker's hands. His hands were shaking, not trembling for effect, shaking the way a body shakes when it has been running on fear for 2 days, and the fear has finally caught up. My mother's composure was still on, but it was on the way a coat of paint is on over rot. You could see, if you knew her, the immense work it was taking to keep the surface flat. The music kept playing. People kept talking. But a little silence opened around my parents like a pool spreading on a floor, the way a room senses these things before it understands them. And the people nearest the door went quiet, and then the people near them, and I became aware that a good portion of my wedding was watching my mother and father stand frozen in the doorway of a barn they had been too good to enter that morning. My grandmother saw them before they saw her. She was at the end of the long table, where I'd seated her so she could, as she'd asked, see Daniel's face. She did not get up. She simply turned in her chair to face her son, my father, and she looked at him across the whole length of that barn. 89 years old, the woman who'd known the rented half a house and the lights going out. And her face did something I will never forget as long as I live. It didn't gloat. My grandmother was incapable of gloating. It went still and sad and very old, and she watched her son stand in a doorway he'd refused to walk through that morning. And she understood, before any of the rest of us, exactly why he was there now. I walked toward my parents, because again, what else do you do? The dress made a sound on the barn floor. My mother saw me coming, and the pate cracked, just slightly, at the corner of her mouth. And she said, and I will give her this, she tried, even then, to make it sound like the visit was the point. "Diane, we came. We changed our minds. We wanted to be here." And my father said, over her, in a voice I had never heard from him, a voice with the bottom gone out of it, "Diane, we need to talk to you and Daniel, privately. And he stopped, and his shaking hands came up in a small, helpless gesture that took in the barn, the lights, the dress, the whole wedding he had skipped. It's about the house. There it was. Not Diane, we're sorry. Not Diane, you look beautiful. Not Diane, we were wrong about him. It's about the house. They had skipped my wedding to protect their pride, and now their pride was a hole in the ground full of rainwater. And they had driven 90 miles to ask the simple man for the only thing they had ever truly worshipped. We went into the side room, the one with the folding tables, where Kevin was still waiting, and went a shade paler when he saw all of us file in. The whole Coleman family and the man they decided wasn't one of us, standing among stacked chairs while a wedding I paid for myself went on without us, on the other side of a thin wall. My father couldn't get the words out at first. It was my mother who did it, finally, because my mother can always do the thing that needs a flat surface and no feeling. She laid it out the way she'd once laid out the features of a house to a buyer: the development, the guarantee, the bank, the date, the number. $74,000 by close of business Monday, or the process starts. She said the number, and then she did the thing I'd been rehearsing other people doing for weeks. She looked at Daniel, not at me, and she asked. I had imagined this moment. I told you that. I had lain awake building the scene where they needed me, and I got to be calm and final and closed, like a door. And now here it was, more complete than anything I'd designed in the dark. My mother actually asking, my father's hands actually shaking, and I waited for the satisfaction to arrive. It didn't arrive. That's the thing nobody tells you about the moment you've rehearsed. What I felt, standing there, was not triumph. It was a kind of vertigo, a falling feeling, because the people in front of me were not the giants I built my whole defended life against. They were two frightened old people in good clothes, and one of them had taught me to drive in an empty parking lot on Sunday mornings with 2 coffees, and the other had sat up all night painting calamine on my chicken pox, humming something with no tune, and I discovered, to my genuine surprise, that I did not want to watch them suffer. I'd wanted it for years. I'd polished the wanting, and now that it was free for the taking, I found I'd been carrying it the way you carry a stone you've forgotten is heavy. And all I wanted, suddenly, was to set it down. But I didn't say anything yet, because it wasn't my answer to give. It was Daniel's money. They had asked Daniel. I have replayed what my husband did in that room more times than I've replayed almost anything in my life. And I still think it's the finest thing I've ever watched a person do. He didn't make them wait. That's the first thing. A lesser man, and I include myself, on my worst nights, in the category of lesser, would have let the silence stretch, would have made them feel every second of the asking, would have collected, in that pause, the interest on years of insult. Daniel didn't. He saw 2 people drowning, and his whole life had been the inability to stand near a broken thing and leave it broken. He said, okay, just that, first, okay, like he was agreeing to look at the coffee urn. Then he said, I'm not going to do it tonight, because tonight I got married, and I'm going back out to that table. But I'll meet you at your bank Monday morning when it opens. Bring the letter and whatever your account manager needs. We'll take care of it so the process doesn't start. He didn't say loan. He didn't say gift. He didn't say terms or interest or you'll pay me back or you'll never call my wife's marriage a thing to pretend about again. He left all of those swords in their sheaths. He just said the bank, Monday, bring the letter. And then he did the thing that broke something open in me. He looked at my father, at this gray, shaking man who had told me across a dinner table that a man who works with his hands is a fine thing to hire. And he said, gently, without a grain of triumph in it, Mr. Coleman, you should sit down. You've had a hard couple of days. And he pulled out one of the folding chairs from the stack, and he opened it, and he set it down for my father, and my father sat in it, because his legs had stopped being able to do the job of holding up the far shore. The man they called Simple set up a chair for the man who couldn't stand. That's the whole story, really. Everything else is just a long way of getting you to that chair. My mother cried then. I'd seen my mother produce tears before. She had a whole vocabulary of them. Social tears, strategic tears, but these were not from the vocabulary. These came up out of some place she'd kept sealed since she was a young woman performing a wealth she'd already lost. And they wrecked her careful face. And she said, to me, not to Daniel, I don't understand why he would do this for us. And I understood that she genuinely didn't. In the world my mother lived inside, you did things for people who could do things for you, and Daniel could get nothing from them. No status, no return, no rise in the only currency she'd ever traded in, and so his kindness made no sense to her. It was a foreign language. She was hearing it for the first time at 69, in a side room full of folding chairs, and it undid her precisely because she couldn't price it. I didn't comfort her. I want to be truthful about that. I didn't take my mother in my arms and tell her it was all right, because it wasn't all right, and I was done, at 41, pretending things were fine to keep my mother's surface flat. But I didn't deliver the rehearsed sentence either. I let it dissolve, the way you let go of something underwater and feel it drift away from your fingers. What I said was, he did it because that's who he is. That's the man you couldn't sit in a barn for. And my mother looked at me. And then she looked at Daniel, who had already turned to go back out to our wedding. And something moved across her face that I'd never seen there. And I can't be sure, but I think it was shame. Real shame. The kind that doesn't perform. Kevin in the corner said something. I don't fully remember what. It was some version of an explanation, some attempt to locate himself on the right side of the thing, the way Kevin always could in any room. And my grandmother, who had come in behind us so quietly that none of us had noticed, said from the doorway the only words she spoke in that room. She said, "Sit down, Kevin. You've done enough standing up." I went back out to my wedding. That's the part that still surprises me. There was a hole in the ground an hour north, and a house with a brick front in danger, and my father in a folding chair, with the bottom gone out of his voice. And on the other side of a thin wall, there was a band playing, and a field gone deep blue, and 100 people who loved us eating cake. And I walked back through the whisper-quiet door, and Daniel was already out there, jacket still off, and he held out his hand, and we danced. We danced because it was our wedding, and because the broken things would still be broken on Monday, and there is a kind of wisdom in not letting the broken things have the whole day. My grandmother watched us from her chair by the 2 empty ones, and at some point I looked over, and she had moved the little calligraphy cards. Mother of the bride and father of the bride were turned face down on the seats. She'd done it without a word. I never asked her why. There was, on the gift table that night, a plain white envelope with no name on it, no card inside, just the envelope, empty, sealed, and then I suppose opened, sitting among the wrapped boxes and the cards with our names in careful hands. I never found out who left it or what had been in it, if anything. Renata thought maybe a guest had meant to put cash in it and forgotten. Daniel thought maybe someone had taken something out by mistake. I've decided not to decide. There's a white envelope in the story of my wedding that I will never explain, and I've made my peace with letting it stay a mystery. Not everything resolves. The people who tell you it does are selling something. Daniel met my parents at the bank on Monday morning, the way he said he would. I went with him, though I stayed in the truck for the part inside. I'd taken a personal day. Let the substitute explain ionic bonds for once. I sat in the old Ford with 211,000 miles on it, in the parking lot of the bank my father had given his life to. And I watched my husband walk in carrying a folder, in his good boots and his one good shirt, past the plaque that still had my father's name on it from some retirement long ago. And I thought about all the mornings of my childhood and all the mornings I'd lain awake rehearsing. And I thought, this is what it actually looks like when the asking changes direction. It doesn't look like a closing door. It looks like a quiet man with a folder, fixing a broken thing because he can't stand to leave it broken. He never told me the details of what he arranged. I know he didn't simply hand over $74,000. Daniel is generous, not foolish. And there was paper, and the paper protected him, and that was right. But he did it without a single condition that cost my parents their dignity, which was the one thing he could have taken, and the one thing he chose to leave them. The house was saved. The process didn't start. My father kept the far shore. I did see them come out, the three of them, my father, Daniel, and my father's account manager, a young woman who kept glancing at Daniel, the way you glance at someone who's just done a thing you didn't know people still did. My parents walked to their car. They still had the car. They still had the house. They still had the whole careful surface, and only the four of us would ever know how close it had come to the ground. My father stopped at his door and looked back at Daniel across the parking lot, and he did a thing I'd never once seen my father do in 41 years. He couldn't find the words, so he just lifted his hand. A kind of salute, stiff and formal, and from another era. The gesture of a man acknowledging another man's rank. Daniel lifted his hand back. Two men in a bank parking lot on a Monday morning, saying in the only language my father had left, the thing my father would never be able to say in words. I watched it from the truck, and I didn't cry, which surprised me. I'd done all my crying years before, on the nights I rehearsed. I just watched my father salute the man who'd saved him, and I thought, it took losing everything for you to finally see him. And then a second thought arrived, one I wasn't expecting and didn't entirely welcome. But you did see him. In the end, you did. I'd like to tell you that it fixed us. It didn't. This is the part the movies get wrong, the part where the music swells and everyone embraces, and the years of damage dissolve in a single afternoon. Real life adjusts, slowly, in small, unglamorous increments. And sometimes it just goes quiet in a new way, and you learn to call the quiet peace. My father has never been able to look directly at Daniel since. I used to think that was more shame, and maybe it is, but I've come to think it's something harder to name. That my father saw, in a folding chair in a side room, the whole shape of his life's mistake. Saw that the man he'd dismissed as the undertow was in fact the only one in the family standing on solid ground, and that some truths are too big to look at straight. He's polite to Daniel now. Carefully, formally polite. He calls him Daniel instead of nothing at all, which doesn't sound like much unless you knew the years of nothing at all. My mother tried, in her way. She came to the house a few months later, alone, and she walked through it again, and this time she didn't run her finger along the counter pricing it. She stood in the kitchen Daniel built, and she said, quietly, he does beautiful work. Not handmade, like a diagnosis. Beautiful, like a thing she was finally letting herself see. It wasn't an apology. My mother will go to her grave without producing the words, I'm sorry, in their plain form. That's not a sentence her construction can hold. But she never called Daniel simple again, not to my face, and as far as I know, not behind it. And in my mother's economy, the retirement of a cruel word is as close to an apology as the coin she trades in comes. Word of a thing like that travels in a town this size, not as gossip exactly, more as weather. People knew my parents hadn't come. My across-the-street neighbor, Frank, a retired postman who'd waved at me every morning for 9 years and never once said a personal word, stopped me at my mailbox a week after the wedding and said gruffly, looking at the middle distance the way men of his generation do when they're about to be kind, heard your folks didn't make it to your wedding. Their loss. That husband of yours regraded my driveway last spring and wouldn't take a dime. Then he went back inside, having said more to me in those 3 sentences than in 9 years, and I stood at the mailbox feeling unexpectedly seen. A woman I taught alongside, Marcy, who'd always treated me as slightly beneath her because I'd come to teaching late and through community college, softened toward me that fall in a way I didn't understand until she told me, near Christmas, that she'd had parents like mine, and that watching me keep my dignity through it had meant something to her. The injuries you think are private are almost never as private as you believe. People see more than they say. They'd known for years what my family was, and they'd been waiting, in the patient way of small towns, for me to find out I deserved better. Kevin, I rarely see. The lakeside development took him down with it, the whole glittering structure of borrowing he'd built. And last I heard, he'd moved to another state and was selling something else to someone else, starting the climb over from a lower rung. He didn't pay my parents back, of course. He didn't pay me my $9,000 from 8 years ago either. I never expected him to, and I find to my own surprise that I no longer keep the number. It left me somewhere on the drive home from that bank. I went looking for it the other day, the way your tongue goes looking for the missing tooth, and the socket had healed over, and I couldn't find the gap. She came to dinner often in that time, always seated where she could see Daniel, and she and he developed a friendship that ran almost entirely on few words and long companionable silences. Two people who knew the value of things because they'd both known the lack of them. The last real conversation I had with her, she held my hand and said, in that flat, dry voice that never wasted a word, "Your mother thought she was protecting the family by staying away from that barn." She paused. She had it exactly backwards. You are the family. The rest of us were just sitting in the good chairs. I've never forgotten it. The rest of us were just sitting in the good chairs. People ask me, when they hear pieces of this, whether I forgave them. It's the wrong question, but I understand why they ask it. Forgiveness is the word people reach for, because it's the only one they have for the place where a story is supposed to end. What happened is smaller and stranger than forgiveness. I stopped meeting them. That's all. The whole architecture of my childhood, the load-bearing wall, the girl whose job was to not need things, it just quietly came down, not in the side room with the folding chairs, but slowly over the months after, the way a fever breaks, not in a single dramatic sweat, but in a gradual realization, one ordinary morning, that you've been well for a while without noticing. The hunger I used to feel in the dark, the one that rehearsed cruel sentences, it had been a hunger for them to finally see me. And somewhere along the way, I stopped waiting to be seen by people who'd spent 41 years looking the other direction. And the strangest thing happened. The not waiting felt exactly like being free. It's a Sunday morning as I finish telling you this. Daniel is out in the garage. I can hear the particular sound his planer makes, a long, even shush, shush, like the barn door he fixed before he married me. There's coffee going. My grandmother's sparrow brooch is on the windowsill over the sink, where I keep it, catching the light. In a little while, Daniel will come in with sawdust on his forearms and ask if I want to walk down to the diner. And I'll say yes, and we'll walk. And nobody whose opinion I once organized my whole life around will have any say in any of it. The 2 calligraphy cards are in a drawer somewhere. I never threw them out. I don't keep them out either. They're just in a drawer, face down, the way my grandmother left them. I made the coffee a little stronger than I usually do. The house is quiet, and the planer has stopped, which means he's coming in. That's enough. That was always going to be enough.